Hello, and welcome to You Did What Now? Mistakes to Avoid in Your First 10 Pages at WriteHive Lite 2022. Before we begin, I would like everyone to know that there may be spoilers for Ray Bearer by Jordan Afueco, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Rings of Power, the Amazon Prime TV show, Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, Iron Widow by Shiran J. Zhao, Burn for Me by Ilana Andrews, Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, and Star Wars Episode 4. There will be slides with text from these books, but I will not read all of the text out loud. If everyone is in agreement, we can always pause the video to examine the text if you will all wish, because this video will not be a full hour. Now, on our agenda is an introduction, so you know who the talking head is, and then we jump into the meat of things. We will talk about info dumping first, where I will also talk about enfolding, because many people confuse the two. We'll also talk about prologues, chapters, and backstory, because a common mistake is not understanding which of these three things you have actually written. We'll talk about the narrator, which is also really about characterization, or the lack thereof. It will also cover a little bit of voice and what voice means. And we'll talk about repetition, not just about filter words, fillers, crutch phrases, and so on, but about sentence structure and some of the bad habits that we tend to have. We will end with a little bonus for querying writers, that is the synopsis. In general, everything that I talk about in this presentation kind of covers the mistakes that we make in the first 10 pages. I'm sure that out there is an error or a mistake that is not covered by this. However, most things fall into one or more of these categories, and quite often we'll actually find that there's a lot of overlap, and you'll also notice that there is overlap even between the things that we're going to talk about today. So, who am I? Well, my name is Keir Alekseii, and I am an associate literary agent at Azantian Literary. I'm also a writer and a cat parent. I was born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago, where I still live and work, and I identify as non-binary and use she, they pronouns. So on to the info dump. Haha. So first, the definition, which I've adapted from dictionary.com. To info dump means to provide a large quantity of information, usually backstory or world building details, usually all at once. Seasoned writers and unseasoned writers, for the most part, already know that this is a no-no. We understand, yeah? But despite that, it is actually still quite prevalent, which I think is a little bit surprising, but I believe that there are a number of reasons that this happens. First of all, some folks info dump in the first pages because they think it is the only way to ground your reader. Another reason is that as writers, we love the work that we have written and we want to share all the things we love with our reader. And as a result, it's hard for us to separate what readers need to know from what we want them to know. Now, there's also, of course, that balancing act between plot, world story, and character. And that balancing act is really quite hard. However, it is also important because the info dump will pull your reader away from a story. And that is why info dumping is considered a mistake, especially in your first 10 pages. Generally, info dumping will interrupt the natural flow of the story and storytelling by interrupting whatever is happening on page with information that's not relevant to the characters or the moment. When this happens, it breaks narrative voice. And if it's first person, it's also going to break character. A tendency to info dump also leads to a lot of passive text, and it will slow down the pace of your work considerably. And sometimes that's not on purpose, so that's a problem. Also, info dumping will provide details that readers should actually be picking up from context in your book. And when that happens, it begins to feel repetitive because readers are like, I already know this. Why is this happening? Right? Now, some folks try to put this into their dialogue instead. It doesn't really work. In dialogue, these issues are actually exacerbated. So when you disguise info dumping as dialogue, it really just becomes worse. Now, I want to make sure that we all understand the difference between infolding and info dumping, okay? Infolding as it relates to literature as opposed to biology is, I believe, a term that was coined by Anna Kesey in her essay, Making a Scene, Fiction's Fundamental Unit. At least that is where I first heard the term in this context. In infolding, there's a pause in the passing of time, and we get a glimpse into the thoughts of a character. This may mean a few lines or paragraphs of writing while nothing is happening in real time. Now, when you read this, you might recognize that this is a very similar mechanism to info dumping, because when you info dump, you also put everything on pause. However, info dumping is not infolding. According to Kesey, infolding is tremendous deepening and reflection and rhetorical flight in which the writer is characterizing the people, recalling their pasts, capturing their fleeting physical experiences, illuminating their mental processes and emotions. Info dumping does not do this, okay? Infolding is a technique used for character and story development and not simply exposition. Info dumping is just exposition. It is to explain things that you might otherwise not pick up in context. But the thing is, a writer's job is to make sure that readers can glean the necessary information from context. So here is an example of providing information in context instead of just info dumping. This is from Jordan Ifueko's Ray Bearer. It is the first page, and it's one of my favorite YA fantasies. I'm going to read the first line and the first paragraph. I shouldn't have been surprised that fairies exist. When elephants passed by in a lumbering sea beneath my window, flecks of light whispered in the dust, dancing above the rows of tusks and leather. I leaned precariously over the sill, hoping to catch a fleck before a servant wrestled me inside. Now, just the first line is rife with information on setting and character, and the following paragraph gives us information on the world, on where the point of view character might live or what her lifestyle is like. We also get to learn about the character through the verb wrestled and surprised, right? Immediately after this paragraph, we learn about the nature of magic and magical creatures in this world and setting as well, all of it through the action of the main character or the narrator, and also through infolding. Yes? Now, look at the contrast against Mary Shelley's classic Frankenstein. The opening pages are a letter detailing information from one character to another, ostensibly because the other character doesn't actually remember whatever is on this page. This is info dumping through dialogue. Maybe info dumping through monologue. Either way, Shelley could do this in the 1800s, but you cannot get away with this in modern publishing. So let's move on to the next most common mistake, which is misunderstanding whether or not you have written a prologue, a first chapter, or backstory. So starting your book with a prologue or first chapter is fine, but starting your book with backstory is not so much okay. Backstory is defined by Merriam-Webster as a story that tells what led up to the main story or the plot. Now, here's why backstory in your first 10 pages is a problem. More often than not, your opening pages consist of backstory, then you're starting the book in the wrong place. That's it, quite simple. If you are a querying author, an agent can really clearly see this from your synopsis or even from your query letter. And if you're an indie author, your book is going direct to readers, and readers might put this down because it's not the story they wanted or expected when they picked up the book in the first place, right? So some really simple and pretty straightforward examples of backstory is Rings of Power. This show, which is the one on Amazon Prime that I mentioned, is primarily based on the Silmarillion, I believe. And the Silmarillion, among others, it's backstory for The Hobbit, which is backstory for The Lord of the Rings. So basically, if you need to tell a story before you get to the story that you're supposed to be writing or telling, it's backstory. Now, this is primarily confused with prologue because a lot of people are like, oh, it's short, it's quick, it's, yeah, I could put it in as a prologue. You cannot. You cannot put it in as a prologue, and you should not, right? A prologue is not the place to info dump. It is not the place to do the heavy lifting of your world building. And that is a mistake that many, many writers make. Now, in the context of literature, prologues are defined by Merriam-Webster as either the preface or introduction to a literary work, or an introductory or preceding event or development. The word introductory here makes it really easy to see why some people confuse this with backstory. Yeah. Introductory means you're either bringing something new to the reader or making something known to them. Modern prologues are more about making something known. Your goal with the prologue is to give the reader a piece of information or context that is or will become important to understanding the story as it unfolds in the main novel. Sometimes you're describing an event or occurrence that happens just before the main story, but it is still key to how or why events unfold the way they do. So this can still be used to, quote, bring something new, unquote, to the reader, because it can help you to orient the reader or ground the reader, yeah? But you're not going to do that by describing the history of the universe, okay? And I do want to let you know I'm sympathetic to this. I'm kind of a world building junkie. I prefer the world building over the drafting so much. But if I wanted to read an encyclopedia of the world or setting of a novel, I would find the wiki. In the actual novel, that information should be discovered in context. Yes, there are exceptions, all right? Always there are exceptions. It's really important to know, though, that the exceptions are by writers who make a deliberate stylistic choice for reasons that are very important to the narrative, okay? Simple. Well, the other exception is writers who are already well established. I am certain that they can get away with much more than like debut authors, especially if you're looking at traditional publishing. So here are a couple pretty solid examples of prologues. First, in Shiranji Zhao's Iron Widow, the prologue is about the death of a young woman, and we come to realize that that woman is the main character, Wu Zetian's sister. This actually helps to define Wu Zetian's motivation, and it's the start of her development into the very unapologetic and somewhat unhinged character that we eventually come to love. In Ilona Andrews' Burn for Me, the prologue helps us to understand why the love interest is involved in the main character's case. And it also helps to characterize the love interest for the reader before the main character even meets him. Now, Burn for Me is a particularly interesting example when it comes to that deliberate stylistic choice that I mentioned. And that's because the first pages are actually split into 3 parts, the first of which is actually an info dump. So that first page or first couple pages, it's 3 paragraphs of just straight up history, information on the setting, world history stuff. And it's unlabeled, right? It's not called the prologue. It's not called chapter 1. It's just this unlabeled text in front of everything. Then there is an actual prologue. And this prologue is written in third person from the perspective of someone we just don't see again. But this person puts the love interest on his path to collide with the main character. Now, commonly, but something that I don't think of as a rule, the prologue tends to be written in a somewhat different style or voice to the rest of the novel. And it may also use a character perspective that is different to what's found in the other chapters. So like in this case, this character, it's not just third person, whereas the rest of the book is first person, but we don't really see Kelly Waller, like, again. I think maybe near the end, kind of. So this is a pretty good example of someone who is kind of following all of those, not really rules, but common methods, I suppose you could say. And the third part is, this is the actual chapter 1, right? This is the opening page, or the first page of chapter 1, or a little less than a page. And it's possible that by now we are past the first 10 pages, but we're pretty close, yeah? This is told in first person from the main character's perspective. I want to go back just a hot second here and look at this backstory history bit. This might be a good place for us to pause to read it. Up to you all if we do that or not. But imagine if this text were placed wholesale into the narrative. If this were a different story, the background described might be important, but this is not a different story. You can skip this. You could skip the whole background and all of this world history stuff and still understand the whole book and the whole world just based on context. Yeah. So there was clearly a deliberate decision to include this information, but they also recognized that this was not a prologue or a chapter. Yeah, because it's literally world history. So interesting stuff. And that interesting stuff brings us to, what is a chapter? So again, with the Merriam-Webster definition, a chapter is a main division of a book. I'm sure that most of you find this very straightforward, but occasionally somebody writes a prologue, does not realize it is a prologue, or write backstory, doesn't realize it's backstory. And they just call this chapter 1, right? But that's kind of a problem because chapter 1 is supposed to be the beginning of your story. If you're using beats, like Save the Cat, it's your first beat. If you're using the hero's journey, it's your ordinary world. And even if you're using a different structure, like a braided narrative or a cyclic narrative, there's still a starting point, right? Your actual book is not shaped like a circle. You have to start somewhere. And that's where your chapter 1 is. It is the start of the story that you're telling, okay? It's not the history behind it. It's not the universe like creation, unless that is very, very specific and particular to the story that you're telling. It's so important your reader needs to know. But keep in mind that you need to separate what you want the reader to know because you love it and what the reader actually needs to know to understand the story. Yeah? It's really important to do that because if you confuse your chapter 1 with your prologue or backstory, basically it just causes reader confusion. And as we all know, readers who are just too confused by the opening pages and who put the book down might be very unlikely to pick it up again. So as a writer, a few ways that you can tell the difference between these 3 things is actually to write a synopsis. Are the characters in your first chapter mentioned in the synopsis? And, in the case of querying authors, are they important enough for the query letter? Yeah. You can also ask yourself, when do the events of my first chapter take place? Is it immediately before the start of the story, like the examples in our prologue section? Because if that's the case, they might actually be a prologue. Yeah. You can also apply the rules of backstory to this, right? So is the entire chapter just history? Then, it's probably not a chapter, it's just backstory. Yeah. So we'll take a look at one more example, which is Star Wars Episode 4. Those of us who have seen the movie, we are familiar with the text scroll. I believe this is in all of the Star Wars movies. And this is backstory. That's all this is, just backstory. The opening scene where Leia's ship is attacked by Vader and Leia is captured, that's your prologue. That's actually not chapter 1. That's prologue. Chapter 1 starts with the first scene with Luke starts. That's chapter 1. Okay, so let's move on to talking about the narrator. Who or what is the narrator? Now, we all already understand that the narrator tells the story. But the mistake that many people make is forgetting that the narrator is its own character. And that does not matter whether it's first person, third person, deep third person point of view, like present, past, none of that matters. The narrator is its own character, okay? Another way to say this is that the narrator has character. Character are the attributes or features that make up and distinguish an individual, right? In your opening pages, it is very important to define who this narrator is. Now, this is where we talk about voice. Some people kind of blithely refer to this as voice, and people will be like, oh, this is voicey, or this is not voicey, or the voice isn't strong enough. Listen, this is an industry pet peeve I have because nobody can tell you what that means. I have seen professional editors sit down in consultations, like live consultations, like on YouTube and, for big companies and stuff, and be like, oh, well, if you know, you know. No, that is not how you explain it, okay? And you know what? Maybe I am wrong here. Maybe what I believe is voice is not what everybody else thinks it is. So bear that in mind, okay? Take this with salt. But in my opinion, when you distill voice into its basic components, what makes it strong or what makes it weak or what makes it voicey or not voicey, etc., okay? It's just character, all right? It is just character because the voice is a character. Your character, your narrator, right? Regardless of point of view, it knows things or it doesn't know things. They have or don't have certain feelings or attitudes. They are or are not intimate with the other characters or with the reader. Okay? Your narrator has certain ways of describing things. They notice some things more than others. If you have a dual or a multi-POV work, your narrator might even have a foil, the way other characters might have a foil. All right? Keep that in mind. This is something that a lot of people forget. Now, I do want to make sure that you know that the narrator is not you. I laugh because I think this is something most of you already know, all right? I think, again, this is like 90%, maybe even 99.9% of writers already know this. Your narrator is not you. But some people forget that, okay? And when you forget this, and sometimes even when you don't forget this, you feel like your narrator isn't actually that important. And you don't have to develop the narrator or work on the narrator the same way that you do with other characters. But you do. Your narrator requires the same amount of attention that you give to developing the rest of your book's cast, right? Your narrator, whether or not you realize it, probably has its own character arc. Keep that in mind. Think about that. Try to define what that is. It's a little easier to spot, I think, in first-person narrations, but even in third person, and especially in deep third-person POV, you'll find that there is some kind of change from beginning to end. Yeah. If your narrative voice is not changing, you may want to take a really hard look at your work and figure out what's happening. Because as your characters change, it is very likely that your narrator, who is also a character, will change with them, right? Now, I do want to define clearly why this is a mistake in your first 10 pages. And that is because when you fail to define your narrator and narrative voice, it creates inconsistency and it reduces believability, especially when a reader is already engaged in suspending their disbelief. In your first pages, you set a framework for what exactly that suspension requires. And if you cannot define that clearly, then you have probably lost your reader. Okay. Now we're going to look at 2 examples, and I will read these out loud in their entirety, but I'm not going to analyze them for you in the video. I figured this is something we can do in the chat. Now, how you choose to analyze this is up to you, but essentially you're just trying to identify what makes these 2 voices distinct. And I would encourage you to go beyond what we do in this video and in this workshop session today and take a look at other pieces of work and other voices that you like to see what defines them and makes them distinct. This first one is from Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. On the White House roof, tucked into a corner of the promenade, there's a bit of loose paneling right on the edge of the solarium. If you tap it just right, you can peel it back enough to find a message etched underneath with the tip of a key or maybe a stolen West Wing letter opener. In the secret history of first families, an insular gossip mill sworn to absolute discretion about most things on pain of death, there's no definite answer for who wrote it. The one thing people seem certain of is that only a presidential son or daughter would have been daring enough to deface the White House. Some swear it was Jack Ford with his Hendrix records and split-level room attached to the roof for late-night smoke breaks. Others say it was a young Lucy Johnson, thick ribbon in her hair. But it doesn't matter. The writing stays a private mantra for those resourceful enough to find it. Alex discovered it within his first week of living there. He's never told anyone how. It says, rule number 1, don't get caught. The second example is from one of my favorite books of all time, Shiran J. Zhao's Iron Widow. For 18 years, my unibrow has saved me from being sold into a painful, terrifying death. Today is the day I'm releasing it from its gracious service. Well, I'm not doing it. Yi is the one manning the tweezers my sister left behind. Kneeling on the bamboo mat spread beneath us over the damp forest soil, he lifts my chin while ripping out bristle after bristle. My skin burns as if it's slowly incinerating. The ink-black rivulets of his half-up hair swish over his pale silk robes as he plucks. My own hair, way more matted and parched than his, sits in a messy bun under a tattered rag. Though the rag smells like grease, it keeps the stray strands out of my face. I've been trying to act nonchalant, but I make the mistake of gazing at Yiji's gentle, focused features for too long, wanting to inscribe them on my mind so I'll have something to hold on to in the last days of my life. My stomach twists, and hot pressure surges into my eyes. Attempting to squint the tears back only breaks them free down the sides of my nose. Seriously, that never works. All right, now let's talk about repetition. And yes, I'm going to define it. Why not? Clearly, I've got a system going. So repeat is to say or state again, to go through or experience again, to express or present oneself again in the same words, terms, or form. All 3 of these definitions are important for our purpose because I think not everyone recognizes that repetition is not just word echoes or phrase echoes. Repetition is also common sentence structures. Repetition is also using the same words and phrases to describe the same experiences over and over again. Yeah. I want you all to stop for just a minute and think about what happens when you read 10 pages of anything and you're consistently seeing the same turns of phrase or words or even sentence structure over and over again. Now, you might think that this is obvious, but what folks do not always realize is that you don't need to say something 4 times per page for it to feel repetitive. Imagine there's only 2 instances of an exact phrase in the first 10 pages. Now extrapolate that to the entire book. If the novel is 300 pages, you're probably reading that phrase at least 60 times. If you're listening to an audiobook, you're hearing it 60 times. Yeah? And this can kind of be exacerbated because human habit is the tendency to use the phrase over and over again to describe the same thing. And it can become very cliche. And even if it's not cliche in the wider world, it can be cliche within your book. And I'm not talking about turns of phrase that you have created specifically for your setting, especially if it's science fiction or fantasy, and you have a sort of new dialect or slang or language, okay? Or like new curse words. That's not what I mean, because those are deliberate. You're making those decisions on purpose. What I'm talking about is not purposeful, okay? It's not a repetitive device, or it is not a world-building device. So things like gravel crunching under my feet or click of high heels, and sometimes actually world-building or setting-related descriptors can become repetitive. So if you are hearing the click of high heels 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times in the book, and you describe it like that every single time, it gets repetitive. Yeah? So that is really something to keep in mind. And it's something that I see really, really often, even with seasoned writers, folks who are agented or traditionally published. I definitely see this happen. Something else to pay attention to is sentence structure. So I verbed. He verbed. She verbed. They verbed. Right? Like he ran. He dragged. He X, he Y. I see that a lot as well, especially when you're trying to maintain an active voice. And what some people don't realize is that when you string sentences in this specific structure together 3, 4, 5 times in a row, it doesn't sound good. It's not sound great. Okay? Sometimes it works because you are purposefully using this as a repetitive device, but I promise you 80 to 90% of the time, folks are not doing this on purpose, and it's not a repetitive device that works. So bear that in mind. That is not the only thing. I also see like X happened as Y happened, or this then that. Those are also all really common ways that people repeat sentence structure. There's also, of course, the filters, fillers, crushes, and cliches. I cannot stress enough how much that also is a thing that happens, and you need to avoid it. Because as soon as you start to feel too repetitive, especially in those opening pages, that's it, done, right? Can you imagine reading that in the first 10 pages and then you're like, oh, wow, is the whole book going to be like this? The answer is, it doesn't matter, I'm not reading it. So I do want to make sure that it's clear that it is okay if your narrator has certain turns of phrase or like ways of saying things that they like, but you need to remember that your narrator also has to exert some creativity in how they convey a story, because ultimately they are still trying to hold the reader's attention, right? And if you fail to do that by having too much repetition of sentence structure, words, phrases, etc., you're not going to keep a reader invested. I do want to address how to catch this. And I will admit that when you're self-editing, especially, or even when you're beta reading or you're a CP, it can be very, very difficult. Now, there are 2 ways that I catch this. One I pay for, one I don't. And the first one is I use Pro Writing Aid. So for full disclosure, Pro Writing Aid is actually a WriteHive sponsor. However, I've been using this tool since before I was aware of WriteHive, much less a participant here. I even saved up and jumped out the cash for a lifetime subscription because it was cheaper than the other plans that they had, like the monthly and yearly and so on. And it was a very, very useful tool for me. And I wanted to keep using it. So this is something I use not just for myself and my own writing personally, but as an agent, when I'm doing line editing for my clients, I use this as well. It does not pick up everything. There's a lot that I pick up that it does not. However, it is useful to help me find things that I didn't always know I was looking for. The other thing that I use, which I do not pay for, though I guess you pay for Microsoft Word, is the read aloud function. Now, I use the Microsoft Word read aloud function, but other word processors I think do have read aloud, and they are not paid. And there are free like text to speech programs out there that you could use. But basically, the MS Word read aloud function helps me to catch particularly places where I'm describing the same experience in the same way over and over again, like gravel crunching under my feet, right? And when I see that, I can introduce variation and add new emotions or sensations. So the next time we talk about gravel crunching under my feet, instead of talking about that, I might not use sound, I might use smell, or I might use taste or touch or something else to describe it. I don't know how I would use like smell and taste to describe gravel, but this is just an example. Okay. So that actually brings us to the end of the major things for the first 10 pages and into the bonus bit for querying folks. I will not elaborate on this as much as I did the previous section, but I will try to touch on as many parts of the synopsis as I can. I will start with the definition. We're all familiar with the synopsis. It is a condensed statement or outline of the narrative. There are two kinds of synopses. Now, there's the detailed one. There's the detailed synopsis that is for you. There's the nitty gritty and all of the stuff, like just everything is packed into there. It's probably 10 pages, 30 pages long, single space. Okay, that's your synopsis. That is not the synopsis that you send to an agent. All right, that synopsis is 1 page, sometimes 1.5 pages. All right. That is meant for you to send to agents. 1 page. Okay. So, what are the errors? I stress on the word limit and length because that is the main thing I see in synopses that they send. They're too long. I get 1,200, 1,500, 2,000 word synopses, and they're too long. They're too long. Your synopsis should not be even remotely as long as your pages or your sample. Okay. You need to keep the synopsis to 700 words, 750 words maximum, but ideally it's 500 words or thereabouts because that's actually 1 page. Yeah. A lot of people try to put world building into their synopsis. Do not do this. That is not the place for world building. Okay. Your synopsis needs to focus on plot, story, and character. Yeah. Some people try to be mysterious. Do not be mysterious in your synopsis. All of the spoilers need to be in the synopsis. Put the spoilers in there. Okay. Some people also like to name every single character. Please do not do this. The synopsis should only name the important players. All right. Only. Coming back to the prologue, your synopsis starts where chapter 1 starts, not where the prologue starts. Yes? So the synopsis starts with chapter 1. the final thing that I find happens with a lot of people is that they write the synopsis and things just happen. Okay. Which is okay, kind of. The synopsis is where things happen. You need to tell me what happens. But because it is intended to show plot, story, and character arc, cause and effect need to be very clear. Character motivation needs to be clear, right? Those things are a very important part of the synopsis because it helps readers, agents, to understand whether or not there are big holes in that. Yeah. And it's okay if your synopsis reads, this happens, then that happens. It's supposed to. The key is we need to connect. When you say this happens, then that happens, how does one follow the other? We need to see some logic. Now, if you are writing from an underrepresented culture, or you are a marginalized writer and your character doesn't have agency in the way the cis-het abled, like, white main characters often have, this is going to be a little bit different for you. This is going to look different, and that's okay, right? You just need to make sure that the other parts of the story are clear. Yeah. Agency is tricky, but your character will still have a motivation, even if that motivation is just survival, right? When something happens and causes something else to happen, that's fine. That's cause and effect. If an external something is acting on your character, that's fine. Just make that clear in your synopsis because that's a factor here, right? Just remember to keep it to the salient, major, and important points first. We don't need to know all of the little details. You do not need to include your B plot. You do not need to include your C plot. All right. This is just the main plot. That's what is happening in your synopsis. Yep. If you cannot separate your A and your B plots, that's a different story. So just before we sign off, again, I'm not going to read this whole thing. I will share this with you in a handout, but this is a synopsis that I adapted from one that I found online. I will put that reference in the handout for you. But again, you can see it is Star Wars Episode 4. You'll notice that I do not start where the movie starts. I start with the scene with Luke Skywalker, because that's actually Chapter 1. You'll notice that there are characters in the movie that are not named in this synopsis because they're not really important. You'll notice that I don't do any world building. I just have short phrases or like single lines that describe salient information for somebody reading to understand what happens next. Now, this by no means is a perfect synopsis because I don't think there is such a thing, but it is pretty close to what you want. Yeah, mechanically. This synopsis is, I think, 570 words, which is right about where it needs to be, right? Ideally, you shave down 70 words, I guess, but it's close. So this is what you're looking for. Okay, and that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for joining WriteHive Lite 2022, and thank you for joining this actual class. I appreciate you being with me. See you.